All right, good evening, everybody. Ooh, this is a loud mic. I'm sure you all can hear me. All right, well, welcome to, I have to tell you, one of my favorite events of the year, and I'll tell you one of the reasons why here in just a minute. But I really want to thank you all for being here. We have alumni and guests. We have our award winners. And then we have the folks who always make this happen for us every year. George Barron, who's our Director of Development, and Steve Samsel, and Paris Palmer, and you all know Mike Porman, but I'm not sure he's in the room yet, but he'll get there, and we can thank him again later. So thanks everybody for being here and for all the work that goes into this. And I'll tell you why this is one of my favorite events of the year. Not only do I get to see all of you all and we talk about great journalism and what's happening, but it's right after commencement. It's right after we wrap up the academic year. And we did that very successfully less than 2 weeks ago. More than 700 students crossed the stage for our undergraduate commencement. And our speaker was Vince Sadusky. He is currently the CEO of International Gaming Technology, but before that, he was the CEO of Univision, and before that, the CEO of Media General. So we were really honored to have Vince with us, and he gave a terrific commencement address, and that capped off a great semester for us. I want to point someone out. If you haven't met him, I want you to be sure to meet. Well, is he in the room? I was going to ask you all to see John. There he is, John Affleck. Sorry, John, can you stand up for just a second? I want to introduce John. He's our new journalism department head. He's been in that role for just a year. Help me give him a hand, because I'm going to tell you some great things about him. So under John's leadership, our Hearst, where we compete in the Hearst Intercollegiate, the Hearst Foundation's intercollegiate competition across broadcast, multimedia, and print. We do well every year, but I'm happy to report that this year, Penn State is winner of the intercollegiate writing competition. We are really proud of that. Thank you, John. I also want to commend the journalism department for the award, for the record number of SPJ awards, awards from the Broadcast Education Association, the Golden Quill, and Keystone Media Awards this year. It was a phenomenal student awards event that we had a couple of weeks before commencement. It was the biggest student awards event that we've had in the history of the college. Our students are also getting their work published, and that happened in at news outlets across the country. That happened in two really powerful ways during the spring semester. One was, and maybe you saw this on occasion, we had a couple of students here in Washington who were writing for the Stanley E. Degler News Service, and their stories were being published in Pennsylvania news outlets. And we also have a new program at Penn State, and John is working very closely with Maggie Messett, who directs our News Lab. And that News Lab also works with nonprofit news organizations and other news organizations across Pennsylvania to do public service journalism. So we're really excited about that. There's one other thing I want to tell you about that's going to be happening this summer. Do we have any sports fans in the room, and specifically soccer fans? Okay, good. If you're going to be paying attention at all to the Women's World Cup in New Zealand and Australia, the opening rounds of the Women's World Cup, and I want to thank John for his close ties to the Associated Press, where he worked for many years, and he continues to work with the Associated Press. We're taking, I think it's 9 students to New Zealand to cover, on behalf of the Associated Press, the early rounds of the Women's World Cup. So if you see anything about the early rounds of the Women's World Cup, that's our students doing that work. So that is super exciting. So we have a lot going on, a lot to be proud of. Journalism is just one of our, many majors and programs and initiatives in the college. There's one that I want to tell you about too that sort of ties journalism to a couple of other programs in the college. The Belisario College is leading a news literacy initiative for Penn State. We think this is important. We think it's important that students understand how to consume news, how to parse what we call news from noise. So we have a podcast. You can find it on your phone and on your podcast app. We have a podcast called News Over Noise that's also being aired on public radio stations in Pennsylvania. We're also doing K through 12 training for teachers because we believe news literacy needs to start early. And it needs to start in the K through 12 sector, and of course then move through college. So we are doing all of this work. Journalism is involved, our media studies department is involved. We're also engaging Penn State libraries, Penn State Outreach, the College of Education. This is a university-wide initiative, and we're really proud of that too. And I wanted you to know about that because that kind of work around media literacy really relates to why we're here tonight. And that is the Bart Richards Award for Media Criticism. Our annual award ceremony where we honor work that recognizes and is designed to improve the news media landscape through responsible analysis and criticism. So we want to honor the best work that does that pushes the envelope in terms of improving journalism, but also lending to news literacy, I would argue. And we've recognized through this award, and some of you have been here for many years, you know, Neiman Reports, the Washington Post has been a winner, the New York Times has been a winner, Frontline has been a winner, CNN has been a winner, and actually the awardee tonight has also been a winner, the organization that we're going to talk about tonight. This award was created by George and Ann Richards back in 1994. George really wanted to recognize his father, Bart Richards, who was a longtime newspaper editor in Pennsylvania and a member of actually a founder of the Pennsylvania Society of Newspaper Editors. And he was known for being fierce, creative, persistent, and really a force in journalism in Pennsylvania. So it was so wonderful that George and Ann created this award. Now, every year, Steve leads the efforts to bring in the nominees. We put the call out and lots of nominations and lots of work comes in for us to judge. First, we vet it internally, and then we get a great panel of judges to help us make the final selection. And this year, our judges were Russ Eshelman, and you all might remember him, longtime journalist, has been here in this room many times with the Bart Richards Award because he's a faculty emeritus member of our journalism department, and he is also former department chair before John of our journalism department. So we were happy to have Russ help judge. Dan Shelley, who is president and CEO of the Radio Television Digital News Association, also judged. And my good friend, Jackie Jones, who is dean of the School of Global Journalism and Communication at Morgan State University. And Jackie is here with us tonight. Thank you, Jackie. So let's talk about our winner. And the judges, the vote was unanimous and a really strong vote of confidence in this winner, and that is the divided dial. How many of you have heard of this or even started listening to it? I binged it. I couldn't stop listening all five parts of this, all 5 parts of the podcast. We're going to have more hands by the end of the night because folks I know are going to be going on their apps and downloading this series. It was produced by On the Media. Now, On the Media is a former winner, actually 3-time winner? 3rd time, that's right, 2011 and 2012. And Katya, who's with us here tonight, was here, were you here both times or just the 2012? 2012, that's wonderful. So I want to introduce a couple of individuals, and I've already mentioned one. I want to introduce these individuals who really were the force and the energy behind this podcast series. And the podcast series takes a deep dive into talk radio and helps, I don't want to give it away, but it is a fascinating story about the forces at work to create what we have in talk radio today and why it is such a divisive force. It's an incredibly well done and well reported podcast, and it will keep your attention all the way through. I want to talk for a minute about Katie Thornton, and she was the host and reporter for this podcast. She is an award-winning freelance reporter across multiple platforms and outlets, and she won a Fulbright Fellowship. One thing I want to say about you, Katie, I was listening to the podcast, and at one point you referred to this radio term, someone has good pipes. You have great pipes. Easy to listen to, well reported. And I also want to just tell you a little bit about Katya Rogers, the executive producer of On the Media. Now, how many of you are familiar with On the Media? It's been around for many, many years. I'm a regular listener to On the Media. And Katya is part of a team that has led On the Media to multiple awards and a distribution to more than 400 radio stations across the U.S. And she's part of a team of producers, but she was the executive producer for this podcast series. It's, like I said, it's a 5-part series that also won a Peabody Award, as I recall. So congratulations on that. Yes. So let's learn more about this, shall we? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to listen to an audio clip, so just to give you a little taste if you haven't heard it. And then we're going to bring up a couple of people for a conversation. We're going to bring up Katie, but we're also going to bring up Josie Sturman, who works for Gray TV and is a graduate of the Belisario College, a 1999 journalism graduate with more than 20 years of investigative journalism experience. She's a winner of the National Headliner Award, the Murrow Award, and she's an Emmy Award winner. So this is going to be a great conversation. So let's listen to the audio, and then let's enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Others as the Lord provides for you.
A few weeks after the 2020 election, radio host Eric Metaxas had one of his frequent guests back on the air.
Colonel Doug Mastriano. This man is an American hero.
Doug Mastriano, freshman Pennsylvania state senator and recently defeated 2022 Republican nominee for governor, was at the vanguard promoting allegations of widespread fraud right after the 2020 election. And so was conservative Christian talk show host Eric Metaxas. So this was familiar fare to his listeners.
What happens if these people don't join you in this?
You could kiss fair and free elections goodbye.
Mastriano had a plan to get the state's General Assembly to intervene in the election results. It was a legal long shot, or more accurately, an impossibility. Even the plan's creator, Trump lawyer John Eastman, said it wouldn't hold up in court. But Metaxas and Mastriano begged listeners to get their senators on board.
I just want to say to my audience, if you live in Pennsylvania and you don't do this, when things go to hell, which they will, I want you to know you're responsible.
But right before this interview with Mastriano, something unexpected happened. Something that Eric Metaxas called divine intervention. Mastriano got a call.
Hey, sir, I'm here with Eric Metaxas. He wants to know if you want any message to go out on his show today.
From lame duck President Donald Trump, seeing how the attempt to change the Pennsylvania election results was going. And Trump was happy to get on speakerphone with Metaxas.
Can you hear him, Eric?
Yes, I can hear the president. Mr. President, I want to know, what can I do?
Fantastic. Your whole show and your whole deal is great. So just keep it up. We're making a lot of progress, actually.
With a cleanly parted shock of salt and pepper hair, sports coats over button-down shirts, and bookish round glasses, Metaxas' style suggests more Manhattan dandy than would-be crusader. But when it came to defending Trump's seat against a supposedly stolen election, Metaxas was ready for battle.
I'd be happy to die in this fight. This is a fight for everything. God is with us. Thank you, Mr. President. God bless you.
Yep. They stole an election, but we're just not gonna let it happen.
No, we're not.
A fight for everything, with God on our side. A fight worth dying for. It's a sentiment that many on the right became convinced of, and that some took to the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021.
on up, Katie. So this is designed to be a conversation with Katie, but it doesn't have to be my conversation. We'd very much like it to be your conversation as well. I can ask questions for 40 minutes, but I would really love to hear from you as well. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll come out to you. I'm more than happy to include you in what we're discussing here, because Katie's work is, I told her today when we talked on the phone, when she was at the airport dealing with a 12-hour jet lag, that it was illuminating. I got my start in my career in radio. It's been probably 18 years since I worked for a radio station. I've been in TV since then. And I honestly hadn't thought much about radio and its influence. To me, I thought, oh, people still listen to radio? And then when I heard the podcast, I realized not only do people listen to radio, it is a major force in deciding not only how people think, but policy decisions and what happens here in DC. And so what they've done is extremely important to shed light on this topic, to let people know the influence that certain platforms have. So we're going to dig into that. There may be some spoiler alerts, I'm sorry, because I listened to all 5 episodes and part of the bonus 6th episode, which includes material they couldn't fit in, which tells you how great it is. Want to start from the beginning. You're looking in depth at radio as a medium, and you focus in on one specific company. Talk about where this idea came from. It sounds like from your podcast, you're just doing what reporters do, acting out in your daily life, riding in the car. You hear something in the radio, and you think, wait a second, what is this? So talk about where this came from and how you got this idea rolling, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Josie. I think what you said about the idea that people don't listen to the radio doesn't matter anymore, that was something that I had heard a lot, but I knew from my experience, especially growing up in the Midwest and living there now, that that is not the case. And you're right, I was driving through northern Minnesota. I was out on a reporting trip, and I flipped on, the one radio station on the FM dial that my car radio could pick up, and I was listening to it, and it was playing Focus on the Family, which is a long-standing evangelical talk radio program. And I just got to wondering, how did it come to be that this is the only radio show that I have available to listen to me right now? And I kept listening, in part because I was curious, but also because that was what was on the radio, and it was a long and a lonely drive, and I sort of could envision this alternative reality where this is the media that was available to me, and this is what I would consume at all times without the opportunity to have a variety of perspectives presented to me. I also have a background working in radio, working in community radio, working behind the scenes at community radio stations and in organizations that support radio stations. And so to me, I had sort of seen this very strange behind the scenes look into how the radio industry works, specifically from the non-commercial side. Did a lot of digging through the FCC's databases and public filings and things like this. And I had seen a lot of fraudulent station applications that were made under sort of false pretenses or did not actually adhere to the requirements to make certain types of radio stations, low power FM, non-commercial radio. But I knew that no one was checking it because a lot of the stations that I had seen after the fact had gotten on the air. And so to me, it was really an opportunity to explore these sort of deep questions that I had of how is it that the radio dial has become so sort of one-sided in a lot of parts of the U.S. And, some of that made it into the series, some of that did not make it into the series. But it was really sort of a lifelong curiosity for me as someone growing up in the Midwest and working in radio.
And for those of you who have listened, and if you haven't listened yet, it's not just a podcast that's about the modern day and the political climate and the voices that exist. It's also a history lesson that gives us the context to explain how did we get here, what rules existed before, what decisions were made before, what people had influence previously, and how did they get into these positions. So it really does take you back through decades of history when it comes to radio and the media and how we got to this modern day point. You were essentially on that drive in an echo chamber, and what you're illustrating in this podcast is that radio in this one company from this forum can be an echo chamber. But to get to that point, you had to, I assume, listen to hours and hours and months of radio. Tell everybody about the process, because we're talking about radio clips from decades ago. How did you find them? You point out in the podcast that radio is a forum where a lot of people are given liberty to say whatever they want. We know the current status of things with Twitter. Somebody can find what you have said in those characters in a very cursory search. Finding what's said on the radio is very difficult. You illustrate this point in your podcast. So how did you find all of this archival footage, root through it, and basically assemble something so interesting out of that? Give us the process background.
Thanks so much for asking about that, because to me, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to do this series as a podcast, is because it's about radio. It's so sonically rich. I also knew it would be quite a challenge because, as you mentioned, we do say in this series, radio, it's here and then it's gone. Oftentimes there are not transcripts online. There are sometimes broadcast archives, but transcripts can be quite rare. Historically speaking, the archives for more historical radio are pretty sparse. They are here, and a lot of this reporting was done during the pandemic, and so coming in was not an easy option. So I knew it would be a challenge, but to me it was kind of exactly why I wanted to do this as a podcast series, as a series in audio. I used to work in public history as well, so to me understanding the historical context was really important. And so it was a lot of live listening, a lot of live recording, a lot of going back through what I could find online and plugging it into my transcription software. And I'm sorry that I made very, very good use of my unlimited Trint subscriptions for those who use Trint as a transcriber, as I was transcribing tons and tons of broadcasts that I had recorded or that I had found online. Also, as a lot of people in this room may know, people who love radio, myself included, can be sometimes fanatical about radio, and there are a lot of people who have done incredible archival and documentation work that they share online, which was helpful for some of the historical component as well. It was a lot of digging, a lot of live listening, a lot of live recording, and sort of putting myself in the way of stumbling into the perfect clips.
A lot of work. And did you do this by yourself?
Katya, my fantastic editor.
She's like, no, I was not part of that at all, this listening to all this footage.
The listening, I suppose. I did a lot of the listening by myself and digging through the archives. But I will just say, I'm a freelancer. I cold pitched Katya and On the Media, a show that I love and have immense respect for, and was truly overjoyed that they were willing to take on such a big project and a big idea from a freelancer. So had incredible support in Katya.
Absolutely.
We did it for the Bart Richards.
Absolutely. What's so interesting about this is in the media, we have media critics. There are newspapers who employ people to do this. There are obviously pundits and commentators who have no problem talking about the media and what it is we do, but not many of them give the context and the history behind that and really dig in. Talk about your experience and why you thought it was so important to not just lay out these first couple of episodes to kind of illustrate one of the companies involved here, and we'll get to that in just a minute, but also once you sort of laid out the case for one company that was having a lot of influence, to take people back and sort of set the scene for them so they understood how this was possible. Talk about the importance of not just telling people where we are right now, but building for them the historical context so that they can understand how this all is possible and how we can end up as an echo chamber in a media platform, as a country, as viewers or listeners? How does that happen?
Sure. For me, one of the things that I really love when people do in media criticism and media reporting is when they provide some of the context to explain not just what people are seeing or listening to or reading, but why it is that they're reading or listening to that, sort of what economic forces have gotten that exact piece of media in front of them. And to me, I really wanted to sort of do a political economy of the radio industry, without using that term. Because one of the things that we showed in this series that we talked a lot about is that there is certainly a market for this material, absolutely. But there have also been very specific regulatory and deregulatory decisions that have enabled the American right in particular to sort of dominate the radio dial. That's really what we show in the 3rd and 4th episodes, which are sort of the deep dive into the history. There was a time when the radio dial in the US was very, very diverse, very varied. You could hear a lot of different perspectives. It was, in some ways, required through regulation. And so folks could be listening to the same station and get a lot of different perspectives. Those decisions were sort of gutted throughout the 80s and especially into the 90s. And there were also content as well as economic decisions that allowed the industry to consolidate dramatically at the same time that they were shifting to the right for reasons that we explain in depth in this series. But to me, it's really important to complicate the idea that people are only consuming the media they're consuming because it's exactly what they want to consume. And I think that to me was really important to show.
It's all they can consume.
It's often all they can consume. And one of the things that, I know we'll talk about Salem Media, the group that we sort of looked into in the series, in a moment, but something that was fascinating to me about this organization, or this company, excuse me, publicly traded company, is that they are not just on the radio. They have a very secure base on the radio, but they're very much a multimedia entity. They have a lot of conservative news sites, Hot Air and Red State. They have an influencer network. They have podcasts. They have services that sell sermons to pastors. And so even folks who may be feeling and believing that they have a somewhat balanced media diet often don't necessarily know that their diet may be coming largely or even exclusively from one company.
So let's talk about this. We're going to ruin this for you. This series is largely about Salem Media, which is a huge force when it comes to radio. But as you said, they're not isolated to this one platform. They have a stronghold when it comes to conservative messaging across the country on various different platforms. You're an investigative reporter. That's obvious from this podcast. I'm an investigative reporter, and the first rule for us is always not to go in with any conclusions about who is necessarily the villain or who's the good guy. We have to go in. We can't lay out exactly the case. We have to sort of see where the path takes us. So I'm curious for you, as you began to report this out, you started your pre-reporting, you go to pitch this idea to On the Media. Salem is the focus for good reason, as you lay out in these 5 episodes. At what point did you realize they are the focus, given their influence in this? Did you see it right away? Was it clear from the filings you read, the recordings you heard, the people whose messaging you heard? What made you flag this and go, oh, this is the point of interest?
Absolutely. I think what really made me take an interest in Salem Media in particular was not that they're not the largest station owner. What really made me interested in them was that they fly very much under the radar. They're a sort of B-list or C-list of right-wing celebrities, but they have an incredibly influential reach. They only own just about 100 stations, but they syndicate to over 3,000 stations. So nearly 1 in 5 radio stations in the country is airing some sort of Salem content.
1 in 5.
Through their syndication arm. So just an incredibly far reach. But I noticed that they did not get any of the attention that especially some TV outlets get, outlets like Fox, but even the sort of stars of the conservative radio dial, the Glenn Becks and the Sean Hannitys. And so I wanted to look into Salem because they were this sort of overlooked entity that is really using their secure base on the radio to launch a broader media empire. And I was also curious about them because they are a publicly traded company, but they are also motivated by much more than profit. That is written explicitly in their public filings. They say that they build themselves as the nation's leading Christian conservative media entity, and they say in their public filings that they will sometimes work against audience preferences or advertiser preferences in order to promote the mission of promoting that content. So right off the bat, the argument that this is just what's profitable and this is what makes money was out the window. And I was curious about looking at an explicitly ideological company.
Because that's crazy. Anyone who has experience with the media, we think, well, they're doing this to make money. They've found the audience that will listen to this, that the advertisers want to advertise for because they draw in money. But this company says outright, we're not driven by profits, yet they have a very lucrative profit base that allows them to continue on with all this work. So sort of, sorry, spoiler alert, illuminate for everybody how this system works with Salem specifically, that they can, I don't want to say get away with, but that they can have a broad platform for their sort of messaging where the profitability or the shareholders really don't matter to them.
Yeah, it is a really pretty unique model in the media industry, certainly. And one of the ways that Salem makes their money is they have a handful of different sort of verticals within their radio holdings. And they started as a small Christian radio network in the early 1970s. And a lot of their base comes from, their sort of secure financial base, comes from their explicitly Christian talk stations. They have a large number of church ministries who come back, who have paid programs on the air. From the beginning, they were a commercial outlet rather than a non-commercial outlet, so they could accept money for running certain programming. And so they sort of have these recurring ministries that run on the air who come back year after year, 95% of them, even with rate increases. And that gives them this really sort of secure financial base with which they can explore different voices on the air. They're not as beholden to advertisers. They're not as, beholden to the whims of listener preferences. And so I think, in current news, there has been a lot of speculation about the fact that Tucker Carlson, ultimately had a huge, huge viewership, but couldn't necessarily hold down advertisers. Advertiser boycotts is not necessarily as much of a concern for an outlet like Salem.
So they can essentially operate however they want because they're not worried about the dollars and cents of the business. They have that secured, so then they can say and do whatever they want. Yeah,
I think that is largely the case. Of course, they have to stay solvent, they have to stay operational, but they do have a sort of advantage in that way that they do have these recurring ministries that end up sort of being a really large part of their radio budget.
And we're talking, again, if anybody, you've got questions. We want to hear it. You have a bunch of questions. All right, let's hear, John. Let's hear your questions.
Okay, so if money's not the motivation, what's the motivation?
That's a great question.
Yeah, that was one of the things we wanted to ask as well. I mean, as Phil Boyce said, Phil Boyce is the senior vice president of all talk content across the conservative talk stations and the Christian talk stations at Salem, who I was able to secure an interview with. As he said, everything we do is designed to make money, but also we're in this to save America. And so they are very much an ideologically motivated company. They have an idea of what saving America means to them. To Phil Boyce in particular, in our conversation, he put a lot of emphasis on quote-unquote securing elections, but which is often not just securing elections, but keeping people from voting as a very important cause for him right now. And so it is very much an ideologically motivated company, as they say very explicitly and make no gestures otherwise.
You've got other questions. We want to hear them. Anybody who has them?
I'll ask one more and then I'll shut up. So, as someone who had not heard of Salem before this podcast, just living as an American, it felt to me that Rush Limbaugh was like a pivotal figure in terms of in terms of demonstrating the power of a conservative media star to that. And I guess I'm just sort of curious where that fits in. Is it pre-Salem, post? Is he riffing off like their ideas, or how does that work? And I'm also interested, I guess, in the separately, like the deregulation story of the 80s. Is that like a Reagan era initiative, basically?
Yeah. And not separately in many ways, because those stories are very much linked. We go into this in depth in some of the history episodes, but Rush Limbaugh was certainly incredibly talented. He was also not necessarily a new voice on the airwaves. There has been conservative talk on the American radio dial for many decades. It's been very successful at a time as was more progressive talk and more sort of varied viewpoints of talk radio. There was a time, especially due to some court cases during the civil rights movement, that a diverse array of opinions was really encouraged on the airwaves. And even before that, in the aftermath of World War II, there were policies that were put in place that were designed to encourage, multiple perspectives, and that was really actually a boon for conservatives who were able to sort of get on the airwaves for the first time not for the first time, but it kind of reestablished their place on the airwaves, that they had, as some of them saw, lost with the beginning of World War II and a censorship program that went into place on both sides of the political spectrum. And so throughout, the history of the American radio dial, there have been decisions that have been made and put in place that have encouraged talk, including conservative talk, to really thrive. And so Rush Limbaugh, in many ways, was not doing anything new, but he was kind of the right guy at the right time. He came along in this very deregulatory period, starting in the early 1980s. A lot of the decisions that had enabled different viewpoints to get on the airwaves were being rolled back and being eradicated. And then in 1987, the Fairness Doctrine was overturned, which required at least nominally, a balance of viewpoints on the airwaves. We dive into that more in the series. But Rush Limbaugh was, a failed disc jockey. He had been fired many times. He ended up sort of making a name for himself in the Sacramento market, but right when all of this deregulatory fervor was kind of coming to a head, he was the local star in Sacramento, and he got picked up nationally. And he had a lot of success, and a lot of people sort of followed that model. But there's more to it than just that sort of listener preference as well. I mean, throughout the 1980s, as those regulatory decisions were being rolled back, a lot of the decisions that were being rolled back were choices that were made in the aftermath of the civil rights movement and during the civil rights movement that were put in place to ensure, through the very, very, very hard work of civil rights activists and leaders, to ensure that the civil rights movement got coverage, because that was not the case. And it was those decisions that were rolled back during the 1980s, and that led to those who already had an advantage in the marketplace, large companies, large station owners, to consolidate their power, and often those stations were leaning to the right. And Rush Limbaugh sort of pushed it to a new level.
And on the regulatory front, part of what you lay out in this podcast is that regulations were put in place to sort of feed the diversity of voices on the air. So people got a steady diet of, vegetables and meat. They wanted to hear everything that was going on, all of the different viewpoints. But you also point out in this series that these are mostly public relations in some ways. It looks like we have these great laws on the books that ensure we're getting fairness, that everybody has a viewpoint and a place. But when it comes to actually enforcing that these things are laid out and carried out the way that they were intended, it doesn't happen that way.
I think there was a time when it happened much more. In the history episodes, we sort of chronicle how people on both sides of the political spectrum, to oversimplify the nature of politics, had been sort of excluded from the airwaves throughout the decades, throughout the century or so of radio history. But there was a time when those regulations were very effective, a moment that one of the folks who I interviewed, Mark Lloyd, some may know him, called the public interest moment, which allowed the sort of public interest programming, both on television and on the radio, to really take off. A lot of those regulations were rolled back, but there is still a requirement on the books for radio stations to serve the public interest. This is true for public stations, this is true for commercial stations, AM and FM. And the reason that they are required to uphold that is because they're given the space on the broadcast spectrum, on the radio spectrum, which is also used for internet, for a whole host of other uses. They're given that space for free. An internet company pays to use the electromagnetic spectrum. A radio station is given it for free in exchange for the promise to serve the public interest. That's really the only regulation that's still on the books, and that is what has been really, really hollowed out.
Do you feel like radio at this point is still done overall, even based after your reporting? Do you still feel like it is done as a medium in the public good?
I think it absolutely, in some instances, is, and can be. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to report this series was because I love radio. I've been involved in radio since I was a teenager. I was very curious about the sort of gap between the public interest goals and the public interest sort of promises, and how a lot of people end up actually experiencing the radio dial. And so I do think there are incredible examples of the radio truly being a space for public service. And this is in the commercial and in the non-commercial bands on the AM and the FM bands. But I do think that that has become, sort of the outlier, especially in the post-96 era of massive consolidation.
So talk about your goals with a podcast like this, because you're exposing something. You're exposing the shortcomings and regulations that are designed to get a diversity of voices out there. So when you take on a project like this, are you hoping for legislative change? Are you hoping just to inform the public that the diet they're eating is not as diverse as they might think it is because it's coming from one place? What was your intention when you set out with this, and what were your goals?
Sure, yeah, I think for me, the goal was just to shine a light on something that I saw as incredibly influential and very, very minimally discussed. As I mentioned, I know from personal experience that the radio dial is still plays a huge, huge role in people's lives. And yet I very rarely saw reporting on it. Even, reporting that would focus on radio companies would often talk about their other holdings, talk about their podcasts, focus on their digital presence, which is very, very important and certainly important to look into for the future. But I rarely saw anybody talking about actually what was happening on the terrestrial dial. And so to me, I just wanted to make clear to folks that this is still very, very influential. It deserves as much attention as we pay to, cable news and other outlets. And I also wanted to, again, just sort of complicate that idea that this is what's popular because that's what that's what people want. As we said, of course there is a market for this, but I really wanted to give that historical context and to give that sort of political economic context as well, to show that, it's not just by happenstance that this is what people are being fed.
You're not eating it because it's what you want, it's eating it because it's being served.
And perhaps it's what you want, and perhaps you come to want it, or perhaps you don't want it at all, but it's what's available to you. Yeah.
I'm curious, who has actually heard of Salem Media? Had any of you heard of them before? Okay, a couple of you had heard of it. I had not heard of it. I know that radio as an industry, like television, is getting smaller. The ownership groups taking over, buying more stations. The same happens in radio and in television. Talk about what you think is the impact of that as fewer, and the people who started this company were a set of brothers, essentially, who listened to the radio and communicated and broadcasted out their windows to share with the neighborhood. As there are less and less of those people and more conglomerates that handle that, how does that impact what Americans consume? And do you think Americans, the average American, understands that they are getting their news, their messaging, their commentary from essentially a very small pool of sources?
I don't necessarily think that people know that, and that goes across, radio, television, newspapers. It is absolutely the case. I also think that even when people become aware of it, they don't know what to do about it, right? Because they still need to turn somewhere for information. And I think that social media, in many ways, is sort of a response to that lack of local ownership and being able to have input in creating the media. I think so often there's a sense that younger generations are not interested in in-depth media or watching the news and things like this, and I think social media is absolutely sort of evidence to the contrary. Very clearly, people want to be involved in creating content, creating material, creating news, really. And I think that there's so little opportunity to do that in such a consolidated market. One of the reasons why I'm really drawn to radio as a medium is that it is free to consume and it's relatively cheap to produce. The hardest thing is getting into the market. And so I think, to me, it was just important to reveal what happens when you lose not just the local ownership, but really, and the local perspectives, but really that variety on the air as well. There are studies that have correlated local ownership with diversity of viewpoints. Local ownership also means, more reliable, or at least local input means more reliable access to emergency information, to all other sorts of information and news that people need, not just to survive, but to be informed citizens as well.
You and I could talk about this all day. Oh, good, we've got other questions. Let's hear them. Yeah, because you and I could talk all day. We already started this.
There are a lot of reports recently that the auto companies are going to drop the AM bands from their radio. How does that change terrestrial radio?
Such a good question. I was hoping we could talk about this, so thanks for that. Yeah, this is something I've thought a lot about. I think that this is sort of the latest in almost at this point a century of hiccups for radio. Since radio became, quite commonplace, there have been rumors of its death. In 1922, when there was I believe it was in 1922, when there was the first commercial radio broadcast, it was said that commercial radio was going to kill the community feel and spirit of the radio. Television, cable, the internet.
Satellite radio.
Satellite radio, absolutely. There have been so many things that it has said this is going to be the end of radio. I think certainly those car manufacturers cutting the AM band from the cars, it will be a change. It will make an impact in the industry. I think it already has. Some of those companies are sort of revising their projections. But I also think that is the AM band. A lot of AM stations, including with Salem, often have FM repeaters. A company like Salem is very, very savvy. They may be on the AM band, but they also have their FM repeater, they have their podcast. They are adapting to being able to ensure that their hosts and their perspectives are heard in a variety of different places. Something that I think is often sort of left out of the conversation about the AM band in general, but especially in this latest sort of news, you often see reports saying that the end of AM radios in cars is going to mean the end of conservative talk radio. I don't think that's the case. It's very prominent on the FM band, but the AM band is also where much more of the diversity of ownership is as well. And that's part of the conversation that I see as being really left out.
The picture you paint is they're very savvy. They know that if one avenue closes, they're looking for other doors that they can also open.
I remember hearing this series, and I remember being shocked, frankly, about Salem and its influence. But two things. One is I'm curious how Salem reacted and your listeners reacted to the series. And the other is how many areas in the country, or what percentage do you think really just have one radio such as Salem? I mean, there wasn't a NPR station nearby that you had that alternative, et cetera. So I'm curious really how predominant it is in the Midwest or wherever.
Sure. Well, to start with the first question, how Salem and how listeners responded, one of the really, really meaningful comments that we got from one of the judges, I apologize, I don't know who it was, is that the industry was enlightening for folks within and outside of, the series was enlightening for folks within and outside of the industry. And that was really, really meaningful to me, because the folks who I heard most from were folks who had this type of radio broadcast play a very pivotal role in their life, or very formative role in their life. And also from people who had worked in the industry, many people who had worked at Salem, who said that they felt, sort of well represented or accurately represented. So that was really meaningful to me. In terms of how many people, have so little options on the radio, I would say that I don't have a specific number for how many people have, say, only one radio station available to them, but I would note that even in major markets, it is still somewhat rare to have a very wide variety of political perspectives heard on the airwaves. Across the country, conservative talk makes up 17 of the top 20 talk radio shows. Progressive talk is only one. And in New York, for example, there are, I believe, 2 Salem stations. I believe there's 2 in DC. There's 4 in Minneapolis, where I am. It's not strictly a rural or small town phenomenon. And another thing that I wanted to note is that it's also not, it's not just a small town white working class phenomenon, as I think a lot of people sort of inaccurately project onto their assumptions of what AM or FM radio listenership is in the US. Salem in particular is really moving into Spanish language programming. They have multiple Spanish language stations. They have been looking to buy more. So it isn't just this, it doesn't just affect those people who don't have other options at their disposal. This is also a really prominent voice in urban areas.
Because I know we'll eventually run out of time and we can't keep you here for days, I do want to highlight one of the best parts of this series is your interview with Phil Boyce, who is an executive at Salem. We don't often hear from the people in positions of power behind these conservative voices. We hear from their shadow people. We hear from pundits about what we think they think about certain situations. You had a pretty rare opportunity. So first and foremost, I think the audience should know what it takes to get a power broker to the table to have those conversations. And in having that conversation, you point out he's affable, he's a likable guy. How hard is it to hold someone accountable for many things that you bring up in this series when they are a likable person and they come to the table to sort of charm?
Great question. To answer the second part first, I would say that, and I said this in the series, in some ways I enjoyed our conversation. You know, we both love radio. We both have worked in radio because we are really drawn to the medium. Phil Boyce, when he was at WABC in New York, discovered Sean Hannity and gave him his first show. He has a long, long history in radio. We had that in common. I think that really helped because we were able to have a conversation as two people with something in common. I also think that coming to the table well-researched and well-informed, as I was at that point in the reporting process, was really important because I was able to anticipate his responses and prepare my answers accordingly. I also think that this series is designed to sort of, you know, give the context that might be missing from just a two-way interview. And so to me, we put the interview at the end of the series. And so you come into it, the listener comes into it with a knowledge about the company, with a knowledge about the history of radio. And so there are things that Phil Boyce says in the interview that I think might be sort of taken at face value in just a isolated, out of context, two-way conversation, but that take on a new meaning after you've had the sort of listening experience of the entirety of the series. You know, in terms of getting the interview, being very persistent, leaving a lot of voicemails, sending a lot of emails, and doing some, you know, conversations ahead of time over email, and being very, very explicit up front about what I was looking to do and why I thought it was important for him to be involved. You know, I think being emotionally honest with your interviewees and intellectually honest with your interviewees is absolutely crucial in doing that from right off the bat. And you know, we have had you know, positive interactions and exchanges since then. You know, there was never a goal to have a sort of gotcha moment. I just wanted to reveal the company for what they are, and I think we do that accurately, and he felt the same.
You had an honest conversation. It very much felt like an honest conversation where you were open to, despite the fact that you were sort of building the case about their influence and maybe some of the troubling side effects of that influence, it definitely felt like you were giving them a chance to explain themselves in a forum that was willing to hear it. And I think that's one of the criticisms of media generally, especially on the right, is that they don't believe that we're open to hearing what they have to say. And I applaud you for being open to hearing what he had to say and taking it for what it was worth. Last question before I hand it back to Dean Harden. Obviously, in your conversation with him, whenever politics is discussed, things come down to semantics. Certain words are used. You can be less than definitive about the election, the results, whether it was illegally taken, whether it was fraudulent. Mr. Boyce uses a lot of these. As an investigative reporter, I'm very careful with the words I use because I have to send my scripts through legal, and if I say a certain word, it's going to be flagged and it's not going through. Mr. Boyce uses a lot of words that I would likely fall on if I wanted to take a softer stance on things. How do you deal with that in an interview when somebody wants to call what's happened with the election shenanigans rather than using what is a legal term that could hold him accountable?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for bringing that up. If you hear the interview, you'll notice
shenanigans.
Shenanigans
you should
abound.
be paid by the word for shenanigans.
It's interesting because one of the sort of things that we had on our side going into that interview is that his host, the hosts on Salem stations, often used very different words. I mean, there's still a pending lawsuit against 2 different Salem hosts from Eric Coomer, formerly of Dominion Voting Systems. And so although Phil Boyce was generally very open, like refreshingly so, and I'm very grateful for it, there were certain sort of walls that he would or would not cross, including using some of these sort of cagey and safe terms. But his host did not necessarily use those, as we show in the podcast series. So it was I think an important sort of complement to what he was saying, which was a little bit more diplomatic, although not always. His host offered sort of a compliment. We also have some tape from him from an industry-specific presentation where he speaks on some examples quite similarly to how he spoke with me, and in some instances very different. And so I think that it was helpful to be able to have that additional tape to be able to reveal, what does this look like behind the scenes, and what does it look like in an interview conversation. And I will say, to his credit, there is less of a gap between those two things than I imagined, and to me it's as revealing, if not more, it's more revealing to just be able to have people speak as freely and openly, and to see that there is not a disconnect, not as much of a disconnect as you might expect when you're speaking internally versus to the press.
Well, it was an illuminating series. It exposed something I was not aware of, and I hope that you all take the opportunity to listen to it, to really dive in. You guys provided such great historical context. I heard clips I'd never heard. I got history lessons I had never heard. I had a perspective I never heard before, and it gave me a renewed appreciation for radio, its influence, and the power that all of these different mediums hold for Americans as we make critical decisions about our democracy. And so I applaud you for that, and I want to hand it back to Dean Harden to wrap this up, and really appreciate you being here to talk so much about your process and about your work, because it was excellent work, and we're glad you were recognized for it. Glad you be here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about you all, but I loved this format in this program tonight, and so much of that. Josie, thank you for your insightful and engaged interview. It was just a delight to hear you. Katie and Katya, thank you for the public service journalism that you've done that really perfectly, to me, fits the spirit of the Bart Richards Award for Media Criticism. So thank you so much. I want to encourage everybody, you've heard this several times tonight, I want to encourage you to listen to the podcast. It is well worth it and truly engaging, and you've just gotten a little taste of it here tonight. I also finally want to just thank Steve Samsel and Mike Poorman and Paris Palmer and George Barron for making this event possible. Thank you for everything that you've done. And finally, and this is the most important thing I want to say, and that is thank you to all of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for celebrating our winners with us tonight. Thank you for your interest in our students and our programs, and for your support. I can tell you that means a great deal to the faculty and the staff in the Belisario College and Penn State back in Happy Valley. So thank you so much, and have a great evening, everybody.